Okay, these are notes 17.1, talking about some of the start of this conflict in Vietnam, including some of the Cold War um, things that happened at this time. Now, please remember that um, these two units are topical units, so we're going a little bit back in time to 1961 is where we're starting, and then going forward, um, even though we've already talked about the death of Kennedy and things like that, we still have to talk about him again and as it relates to foreign policy. Now, Eisenhower wanted to focus on nuclear power primarily. Most of the things that he um, promoted as far as military spending was nuclear weapons. Now, Kennedy did not disregard the fact that nuclear weapons were needed, um, but he also wanted to use guerrilla warfare. He felt like some of these countries that we were going into, we needed this extra piece of um, training, like guerrilla warfare, primarily using some, like the Green Berets and other special forces, are created to specifically deal with the Cold War. It's not enough just to have CIA agents. We actually need a military division that's more spy related and more highly trained. He called it flexible response, that we were able to get involved in any type of conflict and to be able to be successful. Another thing that Kennedy worked for was the Peace Corps. It wasn't just a economical change or a military change that he wanted to make, but he wanted to change people's view of America around the world. He wanted us to seem like the compassionate big brother, that people would trust us and that they would not only trust us, but also work for democratic societies rather than communist societies because of our encouragement. Africa and Latin America were the primary places where this was used, especially the Peace Corps. What we had found previously is a lot of countries that had fallen to communism did so because of economic issues, low education, and then they become problems in the world. And so it was kind of like a proactive approach. The Alliance for Progress was focused primarily on Latin America to help them economically. Um, CEOs and other rich people had pledged $20 billion to just help them economically, low interest loans, grants, things like that. Unfortunately, the Alliance for Progress never really came to fruition, and they didn't really get that money that was originally promised. But that was Kennedy's plan, was to promote America as in relation to its goodwill. Now, communism and Cuba were very close related and still have a part of it today. When they had basically kind of like a revolutionary civil war type of deal, they lost their nationalistic leader and it was placed under Castro. Castro was very connected to the Soviets and he believed in communism. Now, the CIA had planned an invasion of Cuba. Not that the CIA would go into Cuba primarily. They were people that were sympathetic to democracy and America's way of life, and they wanted that for their country of Cuba. And so, therefore, we basically took them and trained them. Eisenhower did not give approval for the mission. Um, Kennedy did. When he did, they basically left a small part of Guatemala here, and they had been training there for months. And they went in and invaded Cuba in what's called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Unfortunately, they did not have any protective cover. They didn't have any, um, meaning like they had no air support or anything like that. Some of the things had, the intelligence had been messed up. The United States did not want to get involved. They did not want to provide the air support because they didn't want them to know that we were behind it. We were kind of like the chess player in the back of the room. Unfortunately for the Cuban revolutionaries, 1,100 of them die. primarily because of the decision of Kennedy. Now, this strengthened Castro. Castro actually looked better to the Cuban people and to the world, and it turned a lot of Cubans against Kennedy and the United States, that they wouldn't trust us anymore. Um, One of the things that really happens here is Kennedy was really put under a lot of pressure from the military. He was young. He really um, he hadn't been in office that long, and he just moved a little too fast. But this is probably the major blight on his character overall, as far as something that he messed up. Even though he took full responsibility, he really did get some bad information from his advisors. And here's a little clip kind of showing you about that.
The president's first documentation involved Cuba, resulting in the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs. The Eisenhower administration had bequeathed the new president a force of anti-Castro exiles, training in Guatemala for an invasion of their homeland. Under pressure from his senior advisors, Kennedy gave his approval to the invasion. The CIA had organized the training of the guerrillas and had forcefully advocated the invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, had approved its military aspects, and the Secretary of State had approved its political aspects. Yet, everything went wrong. The Bay of Pigs was a painful initiation, but its lessons were well learned. Thereafter, the president would rely less on the experts, more on his own people and himself.
All right, so shortly after this Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. 1962, a spy plane that was monitoring found missile sites that were being built in Cuba. You can see from this map down here, they were what we call like intercontinental missiles, probably today is what we would call them. They had quite a far range, at least probably about 3,000 miles at a minimum, at a most amount. But you can see looking at some of those miles, straight from Cuba, I mean, Seattle itself was only 2,800 miles. The United States and every major city would be in range of nuclear warheads. Um, Kennedy announced that there would be a naval blockade of Cuba, kind of like the same idea of the Civil War with the Anaconda Plan, cutting off supplies. They were going to cut off the Soviets from Cuba. They had to come from the ocean, and it just so happened we had a large navy. Um, it really came to that point of what are we going to do? You know, who's going to back down? It kind of came toe to toe in that case. But Khrushchev was actually, which was a dictator in the Soviet Union, was the one that backed down. He turned his boats around and did not complete the missile sites. Because of this stance and Kennedy holding his ground, he became more of a hero in America and around the world. There was a hotline established between Moscow and DC. That hotline said that if there was a major issue, especially with nuclear warfare, that we would call each other before our boats met in the middle of the ocean. In 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev both agreed to no above ground nuclear tests, that the nuclear test would not take place above ground because the nuclear fallout would affect everyone. So that piece was uh, a big part of Kennedy's accomplishments, especially with the Soviet Union. In Vienna, 1961, Khrushchev wanted the U.S. troops to leave West Berlin. Kennedy refused. He said, "I'm not going to do it." Khrushchev said, "You're asking for war, Mr. Kennedy." And Kennedy responded with, "Well, it is not I who wants the change." Basically, we had been there. We're staying there. You're the one that's trying to change things. When Kennedy responded like that, Khrushchev left abruptly. And a lot of people in the State Department and in Kennedy's administration was very worried. Upsetting Khrushchev was probably not a good idea. They were our main enemy. And we knew that from other responses to Eastern European countries that they were very brutal. But Kennedy would not back down. He said, "We're not leaving West Berlin." He actually approved 1,500 more troops to go to Berlin. So Khrushchev responds by beginning to build the Berlin Wall. A lot of it was forced labor from a lot of Germans that were forced to build the wall between East and West Germany. It was entirely built by the Soviets. They built it and they maintained it from 1961 until what 1982. About 20 years, we have a wall between uh, these two sections of Berlin, a town split in two, a major town. Now, why do we get involved in Vietnam? I mean, it's a far away place. It's hot. It's tropical. There's not a whole lot of things that we would want there, and we end up losing almost 60,000 Americans in this little jungle. The French enrolled in Indochina. This is what we would call this area would be called Indochina here since the 1800s. The Vietnamese had rebelled against the French following World War II. One of the main actors in this rebellion was Ho Chi Minh. He was a revolutionary leader. He actually would travel the world to find support for Vietnamese independence. He didn't find it in Europe, he didn't find it in America. The only sympathetic he finds after a 20-year search for someone to support his efforts for Vietnam to become free was the Soviet Union, which of course involved communism. He converts to communism, and that conversion to communism becomes a part of the Vietnam struggle.